Good evening. Good evening. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism here at Birkbeck, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. This evening we're here to discuss Bryan Cheyette's important, and as someone in the audience pointed out to me, long-awaited new book, Diasporas of the Mind, Jewish and Postcolonial Writing and the Nightmare of History. Bryan is Professor of English Literature at Reading University, and in his new book, he throws new light on a wide range of modern and contemporary writers to explore the power and limitations of the diasporic imagination after the Second World War. He addresses the ways in which histories and cultures can be imagined across national and communal boundaries, and he argues for a comparative approach which encompasses both Jewish and post-colonial writers. Bryan in a moment, Bryan will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then after his mini lecture, we'll be joined for a roundtable discussion by Robert Eaglestone and Sushelia Nasta. Robert is Professor of Contemporary Literature and Thought at Royal Holloway in the University of London, and Deputy Director of the Holocaust Research Centre there. He published Holocaust and the Postmodern in 2004 and is currently completing a manuscript on the Holocaust and genocide in contemporary literature. Sushelia is Professor of Modern Literature at the Open University and is a well-known critic and broadcaster. Her recent books include an edited collection on India in Britain and Asian Britain, a photographic history. She's the founding editor of Wasafiri, a magazine of international contemporary writing, and has been actively engaged for the past 30 years in discussion of diasporic and migrant writing worldwide. They will sort of speak relatively briefly. We want there to be plenty of time for discussion, for questions, even for argument. So we'll start with an account from Bryan. The book is only just out, and so obviously we can't assume that everyone has read it. So Bryan's lecture will serve the function of bringing us all up to speed and I hope to allow us to have a fruitful conversation and discussion in the second half of proceedings this evening.
Thank you very much, David. And I believe there's a reception afterwards with some wine. So if you don't say what you feel or think here, you can say it's after a couple of glasses of wine, and that will be fine. And I want to thank all of you for coming to this round table on a cold December night. I recognise many friends and acquaintances here, some I haven't seen for quite a while, and happily many others here whom I haven't yet met and look forward to meeting and hearing from. As David has said, the plan is for me to speak for no more than 20 minutes, and then for our distinguished roundtable to offer a brief response before opening up the discussion to yourselves. As my book is about the challenge of dialogue, about connecting imaginatively, historically and emotionally with others, of going beyond a narrow disciplinary view of the world, then it would be rather perverse of me to engage in a monologue and for the roundtable just to talk among ourselves. I want to call this talk English Literature Saved My Life, and not just because I'm a tenured professor. My teenage son often turns to me aghast and says, "Does tenure mean you can do anything?" By that he means do nothing. Does that mean you can say anything? Not quite, I try and explain, although I have not yet convinced him that tenure is really not the academic equivalent of a license to kill. When I say English literature saved my life, I mean it quite literally in relation to my teenage years. At this point, friends who have known me for a long time will begin to groan as they've heard this story many times before. But it's true, I did go to a secondary modern school which did not offer English literature GCSE, and I had to take the subject, actually memorise Palgrave's Golden Treasury with 3 other students after school. In fact, this is the future that Michael Gove is offering. English literature will no longer be a compulsory GCSE and therefore will only be offered by so-called high-achieving schools. The rest of the population can eat cake or take English literature after hours. But I have been doing English literature after hours ever since that moment, which is why English literature saved my life, or less hyperbolically, shaped my life. I retell this story to give you some idea how important books and literature is for me. I grew up in a house with very few books and none that I would call snobbishly serious literature. And so the idea of the book, the idea of writing a book, is something that I take extremely seriously. A little too seriously, my family would argue. What is the point of writing a book if it doesn't say anything new, or at least try to say something new? If it doesn't open up you and your readers to something that hasn't been said or done before? In other words, if you come from a bookless world and reading books becomes something that you do outside of school for pleasure, so that you can end up in a school and university that does teach English literature rather less pleasurably, then the bar is raised pretty high for the kind of book that you will end up writing. Because of this, I've been most fortunate in my career writing on subjects such as Jewish racial representations in English literature, what used to be called the image of the Jew in English literature, and British Jewish literature, what used to be called Anglo-Jewish literature, which no one was interested in at first, but a few years later, these subjects were thriving, and it's difficult to keep up now with the amount of work produced on these topics. Obviously, my hope is that the same thing will happen with Diasporas of the Mind, or at least this is the expectation that I put on myself, that once it is written, it will make sense to others who will take on the baton. So what is the book about? The clue, of course, is in the title, Diasporas of the Mind, which can be read in 2 different ways. On the one hand, the phrase can be read dismissively as diasporas of the mind rather than the real thing, or imagined diasporas rather than actual or historical diasporas. The point is that the term diaspora, on the one hand, can be deeply conservative, at the heart of narratives or stories we tell ourselves concerning fixed identities and exile from a pure homeland. But on the other hand, diaspora can also be understood as a state of creatively disruptive impurity, especially within a national culture, which imagines new and emerging identities and cultures. One version moves in the direction of rigidity, what I call disciplinary thinking, the other in the direction of fluidity, what I call metaphorical thinking. In short, diaspora is Jana's face and points in 2 directions at once. Above all, it's an unstable term, open to very different kinds of interpretations and historical possibilities, not least in the work of imaginative writers, and it's this openness that interests me. Now, it's difficult for me to summarise the book, which covers such a lot of ground from the 1940s to the present day. All authors, of course, say this because they want you to read their books. But here goes. There are 2 intertwining strands in Diasporas of the Mind based around Jewish literature and history and postcolonial literature and history. On the Jewish side, the book moves from the Auschwitz survivors Primo Levi and Jean Ameret, who shared a barracks for a few months, with chapters on Muriel Spark and Philip Roth, and ends with Ruth Prava Javala. On the postcolonial side, the book moves from Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi, followed by a chapter on Salman Rushdie, and concludes with Anita Desai and Zadie Smith. But as soon as I attempt this summary, alas, I do the book a disservice, because the whole point of Diasporas of the Mind is to blur the distinction between the Jewish and post-colonial. In returning to the years immediately after the Second World War, I tried to show the ways in which anti-colonial thinkers, such as Fanon and Aimé Césaire, naturally included the aftermath of Nazism in their analysis of colonialism, and those who were imprisoned in the Nazi concentration camps. My examples are Primo Levi and Jean Amoret, looked in part to the victims of colonialism to understand their experiences. Amoret, for instance, wrote an important essay on Fanon, who was, at times, an influential touchstone for him. My argument made in the first chapter is that disciplinary thinking of all kinds, from nationalism to identity politics to academic specialisation, has increasingly separated out these analogous histories and confined them to separate spheres. That is why I turn in the second part of the book to writers of fiction who engage imaginatively with the intertwined experiences of Fanon, Césaire, Memmi, Levi and Amoret. Rushdie's fiction, for instance, evokes the history of Muslim and Jewish Spain, the history of Jewish communities in India, and also connects border states in Europe and Southeast Asia, especially Alsace and Kashmir, where, respectively, Jews and Muslims have lived for centuries. Where Diasporas of the Mind differs from conventional accounts of these figures is in understanding the extent to which they all cross disciplinary boundaries and identities, whether as supposedly Jewish, Catholic, post-colonial, Black, Asian, post-ethnic, Holocaust and Caribbean writers. In an ideal world, there should be no need for this book, but there seems to be an increased necessity to indicate the ways in which histories and cultures can be imagined across national and communal boundaries. Now let me illustrate what I mean with 3 examples. My first example is taken from the opening pages of Naipaul's 1967 novel, The Mimic Men, one of the founding texts of post-colonial literature, and this is just a quote from that novel. Naipaul writes, "I paid Mr. Shylock 3 guineas a week for a tall, multi-mirrored, book-shaped room with a coffin-like wardrobe. And for Mr. Shylock, the recipient each week of 15 times 3 guineas, the possessor of a mistress and of suits made of cloth so fine, I felt I could eat it. I had nothing but admiration. I was not used to the social modes of London or to the physiognomy and complexion of the North. And I thought Mr. Shylock looked distinguished, like a lawyer or businessman or politician. He had the habit of stroking the lobe of his ear and inclining his head to listen. I thought the gesture was attractive. I copied it. I knew of recent events in Europe. They tormented me. And although I was trying to live on £7 a week, I offered Mr. Shylock my fullest, silent compassion." Now, there is much here which illustrates the complex and often contradictory identification with Jews and Jewish history in much post-colonial fiction, with Naipaul evoking both the Holocaust and the figure of Shylock in a single breath. My argument is that the figure of the Jewish patriarch Naipaul Shylock and the young post-colonial Roth Singh is a trope that can be found in much post-colonial fiction, from Naipaul to Rushdie, and most recently in Zadie Smith's White Teeth. But whereas this is something that is rendered in a complex and nuanced fashion in the fiction, it takes a completely different mode in the academy. The standard work on diaspora studies, for instance, starts with the premise that Jews, having formed what is called the classic diaspora, have been transcended by newer, more contemporary diasporic groups. It's this kind of supersessionist thinking, the new transcending the old, which characterises so-called new academic disciplines, which are defined by what they leave out. In short, post-colonial studies at its foundation left out in particular any interconnections with Jewish history and the Holocaust. And of course, one could reverse this and argue that Jewish studies and Holocaust studies also leaves out any interconnections with colonialism and post-colonialism. This is what I call in the book disciplinary thinking, as opposed to metaphorical thinking, which I'll now illustrate with a second example. The first public words that were heard from Salman Rushdie after going into hiding, which were not a direct response to the 1989 fatwa, turned out to be a review of Philip Roth's The Facts, a novelist autobiography. Published 12 days after the fatwa, this review was Rushdie's first literary intervention to come out of the international maelstrom caused by the call for his assassination after publishing the Satanic Verses. In the review, Rushdie identifies himself with Roth at the moment when, at the conference at Yeshiva University in New York, Roth realised that he was, quote, not just opposed, but hated after the publication of Goodbye Columbus. In an unusually personal note, Rushdie writes as a similarly beleaguered writer who finds it very moving, even helpful, to read Roth's responses to being so vilified. The extent to which Rushdie channels his own experience through that of Roth's is obvious from the review. And again, another quote from the review. I was able to recognise in myself the curious lethargy, the soporific torpor that overcomes Roth while he is under attack. To recognise too the stupid, humiliated rage that leads him to cry, I'll never write about Jews again. And when the anger passes and he understands the most bruising public exchange of my life constituted not the end of my imagination's involvement with the Jews, let alone an excommunication, but the beginning of my thraldom. My humiliation was the luckiest break I could have had. I was branded. Then there too, Roth seems to be speaking directly, profoundly, not only to, but for me. That's the end of the quote from Rushdie. Roth, unsurprisingly, has pointed out that the tiny turbulence, as he put it, caused by Goodbye Columbus is hardly comparable with the international crisis precipitated by the publication of the Satanic Verses, nearly 3 decades later. Nonetheless, what is interesting about Rushdie's review is his willingness to let Roth speak for him, as he puts it, and to identify with Roth as a Jewish writer under attack by his own ostensible community of readers. What I show is that this identification can be found in Rushdie's fiction from Grimus in 1975 through to Shalimar the Clown in 2005. And I call this identification metaphorical thinking after Hannah Arendt, who goes back to Aristotle, who defined metaphor as seeing similarities in dissimilars. Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which connected the histories of anti-Semitism, colonialism, and Nazi totalitarianism, can be thought of as a monumental act of metaphorical thinking. As I show in the book, metaphorical thinking is a risky business, and I think we have a sense of that risk in the Naipaul quote, using the figure of Shylock. And there is an ever-present fear, especially after the Holocaust, that Jews might descend once again into metaphor. But this works in 2 ways. Rushdie's identification with Roth and with diaspora Jews in general in his fiction can be said to see the stranger's heart, and here metaphor, rather than being a threat, can be said to be part of a Judaic ethical tradition. My final example looks at the post-history of the Luftmensch, or airman, which haunts all of the writers in the book. This example goes back to Albert Memmi's reading of Fanon as a rootless cosmopolitan, which followed Fanon's accusation of being an Israeli spy in Tunisia. Fanon was denounced by Memmi's acquaintance, Dr. Ben Sultan, as a Zionist after a conflict of interest in the Clinique Manouba in Tunis, where Fanon worked for 3 years following his exile from Algeria in 1956. After working at the clinic for a number of years, Ben Sultan, the director of the clinic, argued that Fanon was maltreating Algerian and Tunisian patients, quote, on Israeli orders, or as a spy and ally of the Jews, in Memmi's words. While these accusations were not taken seriously, Fanon's position was made so uncomfortable that he moved his family out of the hospital grounds. After this episode, Memi rightly stressed Fanon's discomfort as a black non-Muslim in Algeria and the fact that he needed an interpreter to function as a psychiatrist at the Manouba clinic. The accusation of being an Israeli spy, three years after France's involvement with Israel and Britain in the Suez Adventure to neutralise Egyptian influence in North Africa, both reinforced and arose from Fanon's status as an outsider, or what Henry Louis Gates called a European interloper. Now, this is just one example, and I show the extent to which Fanon feared in his work as a whole being characterised as a Luftmensch, disconnected from the colonised, unlike the organic intellectual. But Fanon does write in Black Skin, White Masks that, quote, "It was my philosophy professor, a native of the Antilles, who recalled the fact to me one day, whenever you hear anyone abuse the Jews, pay attention, because he's talking about you." This memory leads to a range of complicated, sometimes unpleasant, but always interesting comparisons between Fanon's experience of racism and anti-Semitism. I believe that the alternative to such metaphorical thinking, however risky it may be, is an ever narrow set of disciplinary boundaries. The period after the Second World War was a time when those who experienced the worst, such as Fanon and Arendt, desired to reimagine the world beyond race and the camps. This was a time when disciplinary thinking hardly existed. Diasporas of the Mind aims to reclaim the ill-disciplined spirit of these times, well aware of the pitfalls of thinking without banisters, in Arendt's felicitous phrase, and all too conscious that this is merely scratching the surface of a new comparative project. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel on the launch of Bryan's book. First of all, let me say how delighted I am to be here. This book has been a long personal and intellectual journey. I've known Bryan a long time, and so I'm going to start with some personal comments and then move into some general remarks, which I hope might lead into the discussion later. It's a major work. It's the culmination of over 2 decades at least of thinking, and it's exciting in its opening up of convergences and connections that have long been present but seldom been fully investigated. In a sense, then, to cite some famous lines by Rushdie, Bryan's critical and theoretical readings bring us a newness which not only touches the edges of a much bigger story and will have, I'm sure, many reverberations, but also has the potentiality to alter the angle of vision, make us put on different reading spectacles and shift the furniture of embedded disciplinary approaches, whether of Judaic studies, diaspora studies, migration, postcolonial studies, or more recently, post-ethnic studies, which now incorporate ideas of transnationalism and global cultures. So it doesn't just provide a wonderful window into a range of contemporary world writers, but also offers us lateral ways of reading and thinking about the past and present, which opens up ways of engaging with the complex interwoven histories of our time. I should perhaps begin by saying, as a critic who's been primarily working in the field of contemporary international writing, or what is predominantly called the postcolonial, that Bryan and I have perhaps been travelling both conceptually and imaginatively along parallel lines for quite some time. We first began to exchange ideas when appointed as youngish lecturers at what was then Queen Mary and Westfield College in 1992. As 2 of 3 new appointments set up to shift the canonical boundaries of the then university curriculum, I was asked to introduce postcolonial literatures into the syllabus. I believe at the time there were no courses of that kind across London University, which were permeated as part of English literature. And Bryan was invited to do something similar with Jewish writing, to move beyond optionalization, which in some cases was necessary to have a focused study of particular histories. So we began to share thoughts and ideas, doing lectures and classes together, teaching together on the first year was then called the New Literatures English course, where we jointly put together material on Anita Desai, Caryl Phillips, V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie and others, many of those texts and later ones appear in this book. But our main approach at Queen Mary was to forge a way of stepping out of the frame of canonical and disciplinary processes of reading. And our mutual interest, what brought us together, was the notion of diaspora, which of course is the key subject of this book, whether in the Jewish sense or in the South Asian or the Caribbean or many others. And we wanted to move beyond the kind of narrowness of how those debates had been conducted within the academy. Both of us were passionately concerned with politics, community, culture, the ethics of critical rhetoric, the politics of reading primarily, and wanted to involve these new strategies to read differently. And I think, in a way, what this book is the culmination of Bryan's experience across contemporary literature and bringing together these different reading strategies, which culminate in these wonderful readings of the text. They're very, very intelligent readings of the text, and I love reading it. And as Bryan quotes Hannah Arendt in the book, he says he wants to get the reader to think without banisters. And I think that unsettling of the various homes of these disciplinary studies and thinking without banisters is at the core of this. It was also, this kind of thinking has been one of the evolutionary premises of Wasafiri, the magazine which I edit. And Bryan, in, 2009, co-edited this special issue, on Jewish and postcolonial literatures. I should say that the word postcolonial has never appeared on the cover of Wasafiri. It's the magazine of contemporary international writing. And there are reasons for that. But concerned with writing across worlds, with cultural travelling, as its name suggests, it's provided a forum for writers to speak and to dialogue across the international community and to debate questions, to create links, however difficult their bases, to live together in the modern world. And again, I think Bryan's book is trying to show ways of living together, however difficult, in the modern world, to create these dialogues. We talked for many years about bringing these two disciplines together, and I think the editorial, you sort of referred to it in your talk, but he calls it Jewish postcolonial diasporas on being ill-disciplined, and that sense of ill-discipline is key. There were pieces on Linda Grant, Vikram Seth, Anita Desai, Sizou and Derrida, Monica Ali, Elaine Feinstein, Ruth Fainlight, and so on. It also signalled the publication of the groundbreaking study by Amir Mufti, Enlightenment in the Colony, The Jewish Question and the Crisis of Postcolonial Culture. So there was a kind of wave of activity building up to this book. I'm just now going to make a few general points. It raises lots and lots of intriguing questions. I suppose we have to ask, in terms of what you're saying, and I think you kind of touched on this in your talk, what its implications are for the genealogy of the postcolonial. Does the postcolonial, in a sense, follow after in its diasporic history? Is it a separate discipline, as some have liked to argue, and which Bryan's book clearly sort of challenges? Is the notion of diaspora and postcolonial studies inevitably tied to older Jewish traditions, or does it come from a different trajectory? And of course, there are many diasporas, many stories of partition, as in the South Asian partition after independence with their ghastly atrocities. Not that they can be compared to the Holocaust, but there are other levels of fracture and torture and atrocity, obviously, that fit within the broader discussion of diaspora. And Bryan's already mentioned, and I won't go through it again, because actually before I even started reading his book, I suddenly had this image of the opening of The Mimic Men with the Jewish landlord Shylock and the East Indian Caribbean autobiographical figure of Naipaul, Ralph Singh, in his book-lined room, attempting to find his place in post-war Blitz London. But in that scene, it would almost seem, as Bryan implies, that this Jew, a patriarchal figure and in a position of power economically, culturally as landlord, culturally too, I think there's this sort of sense in the novel, enables Naipaul's dislocated narrator to find some kind of home through identification with the plight of his Jewishness in London. And similar moments of direct and transferred identification occur in Caryl Phillips, Salman Rushdie, and many others. And it's perhaps worth thinking about the extent to which the colonial education system and the teaching of the Bible across the world have influenced the convergence of some Jewish and post-colonial ideas. The association between Jewish and black characters is in fact fairly common, though not that often highlighted. For example, the archetypal figure of Moses, for instance, like Shylock, appears quite frequently in Doris Lessing's The Grass is Singing, as well as Sam Selvon's well-known sequence of London novels about Moses Alouetta, such as The Lonely Londoners. And one of the most revealing elements of this is in Caryl Phillips' 1987 travelogue, The European Tribe, when he talks about his childhood in Britain as if he's living in a kingdom of the blind, where in the post-war novel there was a myopic failure to see the effects of immigration and migration everywhere on the British streets. So as a child growing up in Britain, in what seemed like a hostile country, the Jews were the only minority group discussed with reference to exploitation and racialism. And as he says, and for that reason, I naturally identified with them. And Bryan develops this further in his discussion of the nature of blood. I just want to make a few points to end, just two more points. One is, I want to think possibly, Bryan largely focuses on literary texts post-World War II, in a sense before the advent of post-colonial studies, discipline as a discipline. It's worth thinking about the extent to which these links were already evident before through international literary communities. This might be especially pertinent given the ways in which questions of nationalism and politics developed post-World War II and influenced the construction of literary canons and pedagogical disciplines. I'm going to point briefly to the activities. This is something I've been working on for 5 or 6 years, so it's a bit of a hobby horse at the moment, of a generation of Indian and South Asian diasporic colonial intellectuals who were in Britain in the 1930s. Figures, say, like Mulkraj Anand, who mixed with the Bloomsbury set, as well as George Orwell, has often neatly been placed post-war simply as a left-wing nationalist, father of the Indian novel in English, who disappeared from Britain and British literary history after the war. However, during his 20 years in Britain, which is quite a long time, Anand was both an activist, yes, for the Indian freedom movement, but was also key to forging links with numerous European writers and anti-fascist and anti-racist movements that were going on in the lead-up to the war. His vision of a global humanism, of literature being a sea of stories, and Rushdie borrows this, not bounded by continents or national dividing lines, but drawn together by connecting links, points forward to Gilroy's vision of a planetary humanism and was explicitly concerned with creating an international fraternity, a vision he developed by linking the history of imperialism, colonialism, empire with the wider issues concerning anti-Semitism and Jewish identities. Similarly, the essays of Aubrey Menon, which depict Europe of the late 1930s and 1940s, in these essays, questions of Jewishness are central to the evolution of his developing sense of himself. Menon was half Indian, half Irish, and he worked in Britain, Europe, and India. And during this period, he writes constantly about Jews and Jewishness. In one essay in particular, called It Is All Right, he focuses in on the figure of Norbert, a Jewish emigre who lives in a similarly depicted room to Ralph Singh's in The Mimic Men. Menon regularly encounters Norbert working at the British Museum, and the essay not only depicts their friendship and the impact Norbert's story has on Menon's work, but points to the interlinked histories of the two intellectuals. He describes how Norbert's rise and fall inspired him later to make a documentary film, never shown because the war broke out, about a young Jewish boy, refugee escaping Hitler. The film takes Menon to Austria, ending with the scene of its main character being beaten to death. I think you might find that essay quite interesting, actually. I want to end here, but again, just say congratulations to Bryan on such a wonderful monograph, for having the courage to engage in all the complex and sometimes difficult political questions it raises. And I'm absolutely sure its arguments are going to continue to feed our thoughts and reverberate for many years to come, because it opens up a whole new way of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel very flattered to be here in such distinguished company and to come talk about such a fantastic book. I'm going to say 4 things about the book. 3 of them I agree with Bryan, and 1 of them I don't, but you'll see. But before that, I want to say, Sushelia finished by talking about the book being courageous, and I think it is quite a brave book in all sorts of ways. But it's brave because in our little academic world, especially sometimes in postcolonial studies and in Holocaust studies, it's very easy to take sides, to spout or worse, believe platitudes. It's very easy to have what Adorno called ticket thinking, where if you believe in one ticket, you just tick all the boxes on that one ticket. And these can be political or nationalistic or to do with methodology. And that's not the case in this book. Both Bryan and Shia talked about the metaphor from Hannah Arendt of going with no banisters. I always find that a very scary metaphor. I'm frightened of falling down. So going back to Adorno, I'd rather say that Bryan, he travelled not with no banisters, but he travelled with no ticket. So I want to ask a question about how the book works. What are its underlying methodology? What's the thought behind it, rather than the content? And so here are my 4 things. The first thing is that, as you could tell from the title almost, it's a sort of dialectical book. In the model of Adorno or Zygmunt Bauman, and as you might expect, trying to put 2 things together, it works to do with binaries, to do with oppositions. But it's not setting up binary oppositions, but it's exploring the way propositions are put as binary oppositions. Exiles against vagrants, vagrants against migrants, exile, diaspora. Luftmenschen against whatever the opposite of that is, grounded, chthonic people. Witnesses, victims. Universals, particulars. Appropriation against not having anything to do with something. Redemptive art against fixed identity. Bounded limits, unbounded limits. Human messiness, that's my favourite. Human messiness versus redemptive beauty. James Woods, and a rather reductive form of what the novel can do, versus connections and wider representations. But central to all these oppositions are the one that underlies the book, what Bryan calls metaphorical thinking versus disciplinary limits. Metaphorical thinking versus nationalism and national identity. Metaphorical thinking against a fear of blurring or diluting things. But because it's not a ticket thinking book, because it's travelling without a ticket, he doesn't take one side or the other. It would be nice and easy for a critic to make a list of things, but sadly the book is more complicated and more critically judged than that. The book has a constant dialectical movement. When you have the pleasure to read it, you'll see it moves from one side to the other as it thinks through what it's doing. It thinks through what its judgments is. And the judgments emerge from the discussion. So although metaphorical thinking does underlie what the book is about, it's not a sort of mad shout on behalf of that. It's a judicious working through in a dialectical way of these things. And I think that's completely fantastic. That's my first thing I think is right and amazing. The second thing I think is really important about the book is the way it deals with literature as thinking. In the book, there is no division between Hannah Arendt or Frantz Fanon and Salman Rushdie or Muriel Spark. They're all taken as thinkers and as writers. And Bryan works through their thinking and writing, but in a particular interesting way, interesting in 2 regards. Interesting because it uses very detailed readings, gently working through paragraphs and sentences and ideas and plots in a detailed, calm, focused way, aware of their complexity. But also it works through not just, as it were, one novel, but a whole series, the whole of a writer's life. So you see that the stream of thought in, for example, Muriel Spark, in, for example, Primo Levi, working through all their work, shaping and forming how their ideas shift and change, and crucially, how the ideas weave and interweave with each other like a tapestry, which is part of the point of the book. And I think that's right, too. The third thing I think is right is the way in which themes are allowed to emerge from the book. Bryan said to me, it's like an American book, everything's in the preface. So just read the preface. And actually, that's completely not true. That was a total lie, which is why you should never trust authors. In fact, themes and ideas emerge through the book. The Luftmensch emerges as a sort of hero in the second half of the book. The Luftmensch, the airman. Okay, but the Luftmensch, because it's a dialectical book, the Luftmensch is not a perfect solution. The Luftmensch is flawed. And an airman on the floor is a good dialectical image, I think. But here's my last thing I want to say. The other thing I want to question Bryan about, or tease him about, perhaps. His lovely talk we just heard, which I've never seen before, obviously, said it was called "English Literature Saved My Life." That's a lovely thought. But I was thinking while he was talking, did he mean books in English that are literature saved my life? Because the answer from this is that's clearly not true. Okay, because most of these books aren't in English, or some of them in English, but there's a whole range of things. So I think when he said English literature saved my life, he didn't mean books in English, he meant the subject, the discipline. English literature saved his life. Okay? But this book is all against, judicial, dialectical kind of way, dialectical kind of way. It's all against disciplines and disciplinary thinking. So how can we have, on the one hand, the discipline of English literature saved his life, and a book opposed to disciplines? How can we square this circle? And that leads me to my final point about the book. The book is dialogical, Bryan said, but it's more than that. It's pedagogic. It's pedagogic. It's not a textbook. Okay, it's pedagogic in the best sense. It's pedagogic in a sense we get from English. Ben Knights, who's a critic and a thinker about the nature of English pedagogy, writes that bodies of knowledge and pedagogic practice are inextricably linked. Subjects are produced in the dialogues of corridor and classroom as much as in the monograph or learned journal. Professional debates embed and promote styles of pedagogy. English, Ben Knight says, English is simultaneously a body of knowledge and a community of practice, performing in its own protocols for argument and debate, and dialogue, And this book comes out of English. It's a book of pedagogy, a book of dialogue. English is a dialogical subject, not one that deposits information in people's heads. Okay? It's one which is about dialogue and debate, about forming the subject. And this book is like that. It embodies that. It's conversational, gentle, thoughtful, judicious. This is what English should be in its publication and in its teaching. And English is Diasporas of the Mind is the sort of book that refreshes a discipline. So we might end up by saying that it's not English literature saved my life, it's that Bryan's life saved English literature. Or we might go further and we say there are lots of other lives that, through Bryan's book, English literature is going to save. Thank you.
To all three of you, but I think especially to Bryan,
Book after all.
who did write the book and who spoke for the longest. So, in I think only on labourist or socialist principles are the greatest thanks are owed to you. These microphones are not working. They are a piece of modern art. You have to regard them as such this evening. We have a handheld mic here which we could use. If you can't hear us as we speak without it, please let us know and we will use it. I think it'll be easier for us if we speak without the handheld mic, but please let us know if you would rather we used it. Are you able to hear me okay now? Great, okay. So Brian, I mean, perhaps you should have the opportunity of the sort of next word. If there's anything you'd like to say sort of immediately in response to what Robert and Sushelia have said?
Well, I mean, as I said in my talk, I'd very much like to open up the discussion to the audience. I mean, I know this is difficult because by definition you haven't read the book. We've tried to give you a sense of what's in the book, but as Bob said very kindly, most of the time I didn't know what was in the book.
Major work was called Constructions of the Jew in English Literature and Society. And in that book it was very clear what constituted English literature. And what is English literature in this book? Because it sounds as if we're talking about not just diasporic literature, but international literature. So what does this term English literature mean?
Did everyone hear the question? Or would you? Yes, fine.
Well, I mean, I suppose Bob posed that as well. I mean, I think when I started out, it was, and in a way, Sushelia picked up on this. All of my work has been, all of my. I mean, I think, in short, as I think Sushelia kind of said when we were asked to go to Queen Mary to expand the canon, disrupt the English literature, what constitutes the English literature canon. I mean, I think of English literature now as a non-disciplined discipline, if you like. But in that first book, I was just staggered that there was work after work, critical work, biographical work, cultural, historical work, that simply didn't take account of issues around, of race, really, in literature. And this was about, I mean, as Sushelia said at the time, it was about reading strategies and reading politically or reading for certain things. And I was just, and actually I used my own experience because as an undergraduate, I was taught by William Empson, and I went to a very traditional department, Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. Now it's Beowulf to Philip Roth, and I didn't read for this stuff either as an undergraduate. It was only when I was a postgraduate that I actually saw this stuff. So a lot of it's about reading, how you read, how you think, and just reading beyond and outside whatever constitutes the canon or the discipline. Here, I don't have a notion of English literature in this book. I don't think there is a notion of, even though I'm trained as a pretty traditional critic. I mean, I think that's true.
It just seems obviously, I haven't read the book, but it just seems, looking at the titles, there's a move from this first book from society, the constructions of the Jew in English literature and society, to the mind, and maybe that's a sort of, I'm not sure what that means, a move from real social and political space to some sort of mental space. I'm not sure if that's a retreat from society and politics.
No, I mean, the book, I think, is grounded in history. And I mean, as much as someone like me can be grounded in history, the nightmare of history, no less. But I think I am conscious, and even the writers themselves, I mean, you know, this image of the Luftmensch also became, in the book, an image of the imagination that couldn't be contained. And this was something that Rushdie especially, but all writers don't just want to be ruled by their imagination. They also want, as you suggest, something concrete, grounded as well. And so the Luftmensch by itself, I think, became too extreme even for the writers. That's why they had to ground their work in history, politics, society. So I think the reason I've just moved on from the earlier work actually is simply because all of that work, all of that kind of stuff that I was doing more or less by myself have all become disciplines. And basically, as soon as something becomes a discipline, I just want to move away from it. That's my instinct, to be honest.
I've just got a couple of questions. Sorry. Is Israel counted as a post-colonial country? And the other question is, I obviously haven't read the book yet either, that the Jewish diaspora seems to be being presented from a European Jewish perspective rather than non-European. Are non-European Jews also included? Can I just ask one more as well? Caryl Phillips, I believe, is partly Jewish. He has a Jewish grandfather, and I don't know if that has any bearing on his inclusion. Okay. I mean, from which perspective is his writing addressed?
Yeah. Okay, there's a lot there. Israel, I talk a bit about Israel in relation to Edward Said's self-description of himself as the last Jewish intellectual. And this was a kind of imagined genealogy. He described himself as the last Jewish intellectual, the only true follower of Adorno. So you're probably right, I should have followed Adorno a bit more as well. But this imagined genealogy was extremely powerful, and I think the reason that he did that, and this was an interview that he gave towards the end of his life, and that ends a very big book of interviews, and he deliberately placed it at the end. It was the last word in every interview that he'd given in his life. And I spoke to the editor about it, and he wanted it to be the last word. It's an interview that he gave, and I think it's Gaurav Viswanathan edited the book. It's just Edward Said's interviews. And it was given to an Israeli journalist in Haaretz. And he was full of praise and compliments for this particular journalist, and compared Haaretz favourably with, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times. Now, I follow Said, I think rightly, what he wanted to do. There were two things he wanted to do. Said's last works were on Freud, on Auerbach, and on Adorno. So in his last years, Said went back to these great European Jewish thinkers. And I think there were all kinds of reasons for that. And obviously he could have gone to anyone, but these were the figures he went back to. And I think he certainly, even though he's one of the founders of postcolonial studies, he detested postcolonial studies in the end as a discipline. And also from his point of view as a Palestinian, how could we talk about the post-colonial in relation to the Palestinians? For him, it simply didn't make sense. But also he wanted to bring back Jewish history, the history of European anti-Semitism, back into focus in relation to colonialism and post-colonialism. Not least because the history of the Palestinians has something also to do with that history. So what we have here is, and a lot of the writers engage in imagined genealogies, but the imagination here is incredibly powerful. You know, this statement is incredibly powerful, and there's been there's been a whole industry now just around this one interview. Phillips does the same, I think, with his Jewish grandfather. I think it's an imagined genealogy. I mean, there's a tremendous identification in Phillips in relation to the Holocaust, especially the 1973 documentary, or was it 75 documentary, where he himself felt excluded as someone who was black and British in Yorkshire and Leeds. So he kind of channeled his experience of exclusion, of racism, of the history of the slavery through the Holocaust and through the history of anti-Semitism. So Phillips, again, wants to make that more authentic by creating this imagined genealogy of a Jewish grandfather, I would say.
I thought he does, in fact have a...
I think it's more, I don't even know if it's a grandfather.
Grandmother, actually, is my...
Right.
Yeah, I think,
right.
but I think that the link is not that...
I think it's a much more tenuous link than you would think. And finally, yes, non-European Jews are incredibly important in this book, and not least through someone like Rushdie.
Before we move on, I just wonder if either Robert or Sushelia would like to say anything, either about the last question, but also, I thought, in relation to the earlier sort of disciplinary reflections, which I sort of felt that Bryan was continuing to refuse to play Robert's, a more dance to Robert's tune in a way, in the sense that, you said that sort of, here's a book which, as it were, is exemplary in both saving literature as a discipline, and actually Bryan was, in a sense, his comments about the move from the first book to the second book, speaking a bit about the way in which it's not bounded by literature as a discipline. And I wondered if that said something, whether that said something interesting about a change over the last 20 years, really.
It does, actually. I think, as Bryan said, when he started writing it, he was forging or furrowing, or whatever the case, whatever the right term might be, an area on his own, largely. And then, although there were many theories which were present, I think the late 80s, 90s period, a lot of theory began to circulate around all kinds of disciplines. And so there was no way he could have written the same kind of book within a discipline. I think it comes back to this thing about ways of reading, and those ways of reading, which are part of English, incorporate theory. It's reading for the ideas and the intersections and the borrowings and the crossings between things. And I think the discipline, as Rob's been saying, are really important in its best sense, the idea of literature sparking conversations, dialogues, all those things you said. But I think the problem, and I'd say this as someone who teaches postcolonial literature, is that many of these ways of reading have become very instrumental, and they fail to pick up on these kind of embedded connections. And that's why I really brought up these earlier writers, because they don't ever appear in the postcolonial canon either.
Well, I agree that lots of the ways of interpreting have become stale, but I suppose what I wanted to say in a slightly teasing, backhanded way was that while the content of English literature as discipline has been widened a great deal by work of, as you both did at Queen Mary's and so on, the best habits of it as a subject, its dialogical nature, its refusal, its pedagogy as dialogue and pedagogy between equals rather than the master speaking to the inferior. Its way of thinking through things in relation to text slowly and thoughtfully with an awareness of complexity. All these things, which exist both in the seminar room and in the best writing in English, are present in the book. So in a way, it's although I hear what you're saying about disavowing it as English as a discipline and seeing all the different threads and tapestries, I think that the core of the book is is similar to what English really ought to be. Yeah. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, it forces us to. I think what you're saying also is that it's like with the best theory, it's only useful in that it gets us to think about what we're reading. And I think your book gets us to think. It doesn't tell us what to read or what to think about what we're reading, but it engages with the reader, and that I think that's what you're saying. There's a dialogic relationship between the reader who's following your textual analysis, which is the best practice you can have.
But the text itself is very dialogical. It's always...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so one more thing. It's also, I think that I've got in my notes somewhere that it's a post-80s book. I don't really mean... What I sort of meant by that was it's a book that's it's clearly a highly theorised work, but in a way which is completely... it's all under the surface, which is where it should be, really.
David, you had a...
Yes, Bryan, the lives of your authors cover most of the 20th century and all of the 21st century, and some of them write about previous centuries, going back to the Middle Ages even. So what is the nightmare of history that they and you are addressing?
I mean, the book actually is a post-45 book, and I mean, I take the point that Sushelia makes that we could certainly go back to the 30s. I think I've started reading a fair bit of work in the 20s and 30s. It's a really interesting period to read in, and George Orwell is a really good example. I mean, he did these wartime BBC broadcasts with all of these Indian exiles, and actually George Orwell wanted to talk about the Holocaust to the South Asian, East Asian audience. So I think all kinds of things were happening then. But this is a post-45 book. My editor insisted on keeping in The Nightmare of History, which is actually a quote from Joyce's Ulysses. And The Nightmare of History is the camps and colonialism, and it's a book that follows those through Fanon and through Levi, follows that point, follows follows the Holocaust and follows colonialism, and so that's really what The Nightmare of History is in the book, I would say.
I know it's too late to have a different title for the book.
Yes.
Right. But, I mean, and I don't know if this is what David Cesarani had in mind in his question, but your answer prompts the thought that what if aren't there plural nightmares there? I mean, is there a sort of... I mean, it might be hyperbolic, but it's the word that comes to mind. Is there a violence being done to that past in collapsing in that way the camps and the colonial in the way that you've just...
Yes. I mean, yes, I think that would be if I did collapse it in that way. I mean, the figure of Arendt is important because through Arendt, you actually get two disciplines. You get Holocaust studies and you get postcolonial studies. She's a kind of founding mother in both fields. But what's interesting about writing, looking at the 40s and 50s especially, is that there was no such thing as Holocaust studies. There was no such thing as post-colonial studies or colonial studies. So no one actually at the time, made the kinds of distinctions we would make now. So what's kind of important about reading it historically is to read these periods when it was perfectly natural to make the kind of analogies which today cause such offence. But actually at the time, these were perfectly natural analogies to make.
And indeed, the ways in which just in this country, the sort of racism against Caribbean immigrants in the late 50s and early 60s by people who were opposed to it was understood through the Holocaust. I mean, certainly through Nazi anti-Semitism. That was the sort of model that they had in mind there, and that of course, is no longer the case. Absolutely.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if I may add, just also, and Bryan and I were talking about this on the phone, I think Bill Schwartz did a book about the novel post-empire, and there's this kind of myopia in the post-war world about the extent to which the British, if we're talking about English literature and what was going on here, were actually involved in the extent to which they're involved in the anti-Semitic movements and the eugenics and so on. And there's an attempt to kind of fudge that, and I think it's very important to as Bryan's saying, to historicise it and to see why these things were termed the way they were at the time.
Bryan.
Yes, as excuse me, as you say, David, it's too late to change the title, and nor do I think the title should be changed. I hasten to add. But in I think the title works, but I want to, if I may, just explore a little bit about how part of it works in something like the spirit of the other David's question. Jewish and post-colonial writing, and you've been talking quite a bit about maybe post-Holocaust and post-colonial writing, but you chose Jewish rather than a reference to the Holocaust. So I'm wondering how the word Jewish works in this title, and how it works in particular relative to post-colonial, with which it has been paired or bracketed.
That's a good question. I have to say that the original title didn't have Jewish and did have the Holocaust. So I think I don't want to blame the publisher, because the publisher has been the most wonderful publisher any author could want. But I think that was the title that they much preferred. So I think it says something, to be honest, about the way they perceive the market and the way they perceive certain things selling, or I don't know. But that was a kind of title that we agreed between us. And what I do is I bring together Jewish in relation to Jewish studies, diaspora studies, Holocaust studies, on the one hand, and the post-colonial is brought together in relation to colonialism, colonial studies, as well as post-colonial studies and post-ethnic studies and diaspora studies. So in the book itself, these terms are broadened out, I think, and qualified a lot more.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to see the way that the publishing or the marketing frames the title of the book. I think that's a lesson for all of us. But I think what it leaves us with is this uneasy relationship between Jewish and post-colonial, which can seem kind of separated in exactly the way that you want them to be undermined. The text, from what I've just learnt today, and I think it's really, really helpful, is the interconnection between these different discourses. And the notion of discipline that you're working with is exactly to argue against the way in which Holocaust studies is on one place and post-colonial is on the other. So there are some kind of regrettable questions that emerge in the way that the Jewish and the post-colonial are separated. And then questions that emerge around how we understand the relationship between the Jewish and post-colonial. To what extent is Jewish post-colonial?
Thank you. There's a question at the back, Muriel.
Relating to this, I was thinking that in your examples, what was quite interesting through the reference to Shylock, or even when you were talking about Said, can you hear me?
Yes.
Even when you were talking about Said writing his final books about Freud, for instance, his book on Moses and monotheism, that the references there are not specifically to the Holocaust, they're to a longer Jewish history. And that there's a certain way in which there's a possible sidestepping of the Holocaust in that. I mean, I don't think it's consistent, but one of the critiques of Said's book is precisely that he returned to a pre-Holocaust book and ignored the Holocaust in trying to think about what it could do for thinking about Jewish history or Israel. So So, that non-mapping on, if you like, the Jewish as a broader category, which is not reducible to the Holocaust, might be an interesting sort of ideological move that's happened through post-colonial studies in some form.
Yes, that's right.
Do you want to have a
Yes.
response to that?
Yes. I mean, one alternative that I did give the publisher is Jewish/post-colonial to try and. But I think that's really, and that's what I did in Wasafiri as well. That's precisely what I did with the Wasafiri edition. I don't particularly mind it because I think one of the reasons we have disciplines is to do with the market, and is to do with the way that publishers want to preserve the market. So, for instance, if I wanted to write a book on modernism, I'd have half a dozen publishers falling over themselves. Anything with modernism in the title. I mean, there are certain categories that clearly, it's a peculiar kind of thing about the way that kind of disciplinary practices do work through the market. But I think it's clear, even from the preface, it's clear that really what the book is about is blurring these distinctions and intertwining these distinctions. Is Jewish post-colonial? Well, I think the thing about Jewish is that it's both post-colonial and colonial at the same time, I'm afraid. Who said that? I've forgotten who was. Asked the question, was that Bryan? Is Jewish post-colonial?
No.
Someone asked me the question? Oh, sorry, Vic. Sorry, Vic. Is Jewish post-colonial? Well, it can be post-colonial, but it's also colonial as well, obviously, in relation to Palestinians. So, but I think the point about the term is it's both things. My problem with a lot of the new disciplines, diaspora studies especially, is that it kind of reinforces a kind of Jewish nationalism which discounts the diaspora and wants to negate the diaspora, especially the European Jewish diaspora. And so you get that within the kind of new disciplines, but also within the old ways of thinking as well. The negation of the diaspora is an extremely old concept, and clearly the diaspora hasn't been negated. So within the term Jewish, as I say, you would get all kinds of different alternatives.
Yes.
Sorry, it's more a question about some... Michelle, sorry.
Speak up as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
You talked about the mimic man. I'm interested in this juxtaposition between Shylock and what happened tormented me. In other words, what happened... And of course, not having read the book yet, you've probably explained it, but I'd be really interested to know a little bit more about the tension between those imaginaries. You know, why does is this typified in and sort of replicated in a lot of post-colonial, this kind of identification on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of archetypal stereotyping back to way back when. I'm just interested to understand the tensions between those two and what your thinking is.
It's a good question, and I'm conscious I also didn't respond to Miriam, but I'll respond to this first. Yes, you certainly get that kind of ambivalence and that doubleness in the Naipaul. I mean, not least because the Shylock figure was actually based on the notorious slum landlord Rahman, who essentially exploited Caribbean immigrants. So I think the first thing to say is that Naipaul doesn't take sides at all, you know, in a way that more recent polemics around black-Jewish relations, especially in the United States, around this time, you could have written a very different account. Also, in terms of the mimic man, Ralph Singh was actually mimicking the Jewish landlord and copied him, copied his mannerisms, copied the way he stroked his ears, copied the way he dressed. So, and as you said, Sushelia, it was a way in which it was the post-colonial immigrant that had a lack of a sense of identity, a lack of a sense of self, and used the Jewish figure to gain that, as did Caryl Phillips as well, in his early work and in his autobiographical work. So it is tremendously ambivalent and fraught, and especially using this word Shylock, which you could argue brings in, medieval anti-Semitism, etc., etc. I would argue that's a reductive reading, but I think what post-colonial writers do is that they, in a way that I think Jewish writers are much more sensitive to this, but post-colonial writers can bring in discourses, public discourses about Jews into their fiction, as well as Jewish history. It's kind of Philip Roth talked about in his essay Imagining Jews, writing about Jews and the way that Jews imagined themselves and were imagined by others. Well, I think that's the kind of thing that's happening in this novel. And Miriam's point about Said, I think, is absolutely right. I mean, Said does write about the Holocaust in a number of his essays, but I think you're absolutely right about the Freud. The Freud essay is very much an account, a way of Said really wanting to disrupt Jewish nationalism. But also the other thing that Freud does, I think, Said does in all of his books, is he constructs Freud, Adorno, and Auerbach as self-images. They're all versions of Said. So Said has this sense of himself as this amateur, this figure who's in exile. And all of these figures actually conform to that. Now, I don't think it makes sense at all in relation to Freud, although he obviously talks about Freud going into exile in the late 30s. But the idea of Freud not having some kind of community is nonsensical, and not being part of some kind of professional discourse. But I think where it really shows is Auerbach. I mean, Auerbach is Said's starting point in constructing this idea of the secular criticism and of the intellectual as an amateur and as an exile. And obviously he uses Auerbach going into exile in Istanbul. But actually when Auerbach went into exile, there was already a department waiting for him. He was joining a department. He was not an isolated figure. But so a lot of the time, Said is rewriting these figures in his own self-image, I would say.
I'm afraid I think we have to draw to a close now. But before you leave this part of the evening's event, I just want to remind you about the next part, which is that there will be wine and non-alcoholic beverages for those who want in the council room. If you go left out of here when you exit at the door at the top, you will find signs, maybe a pillar of fire, maybe something on a piece of card, directing you to the council room, where you will be able to buy Bryan's book for only £24, £6 less than it will be available to you in your local bookstore. Before you go, though, I hope you will join me in a moment in thanking Sushelia and Robert, and above all, Bryan. I've known Bryan ever since we were PhD students at the same time, and it's been a pleasure to be able to present and discuss his book this evening, because as we have all heard, its publication is a groundbreaking event for studies in English literature, in Jewish studies, and in post-colonial studies, if we're still allowed to use that term. But I would say also, it is a personal pleasure as well to be able to celebrate his success in producing this book, and I hope you will join me in thanking Bryan and our other two speakers this evening. Thank you very much indeed.